In this video, I want to review completing the square, which is something that you guys learned back in Math 2. Before we get into that though, there's two things that you guys should know before we complete the square. So first, I want to make sure you guys know how to solve by square root, and then I want to make sure you guys know what a perfect square trinomial is. So let's do that first one, solving by square root. So a solve by square root problem would look like this. I just made up a problem. We got x plus 3 squared equals 8. So to solve by square root, you literally solve by square root. So your first step with this problem is to take the square root of both sides. And so this will be x plus 3 when we take the square root of that left side, and this will be plus or minus square root of 8. Now we know that we can simplify the square root of 8. That's just 4 times 2, and 4 is a perfect square. So I'm going to simplify that before I go to my next step. It'll be 2 root 2. And that plus or minus is very important when you take the square root of both sides. All right, from there, to finish a square root problem, we would just subtract this 3 from both sides. And when we subtract that 3, we're going to write minus 3 in the front. And we always want to write the plus or minus part at the end of our final answer. So that is how you solve by square root. Do you guys remember stuff like that? All right, let's do the other thing you guys need to know, the perfect square trinomial. So hopefully you guys know that a quadratic looks like this. Ax squared plus bx plus c, right? So with your perfect square trinomials, here's the cool thing about them. The last term, this guy over here, and the last term is normally a constant. That's what that c stands for. That last term is always going to be equal to half of b squared for perfect square trinomials. So let me give you an example. Let's say we have x squared plus 8x, and I'll say plus blank. Let's try and complete this perfect square trinomial. Well, like I said earlier, the last term will always be half of b squared. So for this specific problem, b is 8, and half of 8 is 4. And 4 squared is 16. So if we wanted to complete this perfect square trinomial, we would just end this with a 16. So let me give you another example of a perfect square trinomial. Let's see, x squared plus 14x plus blank. Let's try and complete that perfect square trinomial again. So once again, with your perfect square trinomials, you want to do half of b and square it. So half of 14 is 7, and 7 squared gives us 49. So this will be x squared plus 14x plus 49. All right, guys, now that you know that, now we can go into actually completing the square. And here's what you guys should know about completing the square. Completing the square is just another way to solve a quadratic. And just like quadratic formula, completing the square works for all quadratics. Okay? So let me give you an example of a quadratic that I want us to solve. Let's do x squared plus 16x minus 22 equals 0. I like that little guy. So your first step with completing the square is you always want to move the constant. Remember earlier we said c was the constant. You always want to move the constant to the other side of your equation. Okay? And I like to keep my variables on the left side always if I can. So to move this constant to the other side of the equation, I need to add a 22 to both sides. So now this is going to be x squared plus 16x, I'm going to say plus a blank since we moved something, is equal to 22. And let's say plus a blank over here as well, because, you know, algebra is all about balance. We want to do the same thing on both sides. So your next step with completing the square after you move that constant to the other side is you're going to want to now complete this perfect square trinomial over on the left side. So earlier we said to complete a perfect square trinomial, we do half of b and we square it. This time around b is 16. Half of 16 is 8, and I'm going to square it. And whatever I do on the left side, I also want to do on the right side. So I'm going to write 8 squared over here as well. Okay, so the next part with completing the square is you want to factor on the left and simplify on the right. Okay, so when we factor this guy, the factors would be x plus 8 times x plus 8, because that quadratic is x squared plus 16x plus 64. Okay, and when we simplify over here, that would be 22 plus 64. Okay, I'm going to write this a little prettier because I know that I can rewrite x plus 8 times x plus 8 as x plus 8 squared, right? And then 22 plus 64 is 86. Okay, we're making some progress. And from here, now we're just solving by square root, right? What we just did at the beginning, solve by square root. So to solve by square root, we just take the square root of both sides. So this will be x plus 8. And the right side will be plus or minus square root 86. Now, we cannot break down or simplify the square root of 86. So I'm just going to continue from there and subtract an 8 from both sides. And remember, we always want plus or minus at the very end of our answer. So these are our two answers. We've got negative 8 plus square root of 86 and negative 8 minus square root 86. All right, let's try another one. Let's do, let me see. I got one for us to do. Let's do k squared minus 8k minus 48 equals 0. All right. So our first step is we want to move the constant to the other side. So I'm moving c, the constant, over to the right side of my equation. We always want the constants on the right side. All right, so to move that little guy, I need to add a 48 to both sides. And when we add, we're going to do just like we did before and leave a little space, a little blank there from where that 48 came from. And we're leaving a blank on both sides. Okay. And then our next step is we want to complete the perfect square trinomial. And remember, to get that perfect square trinomial, we do half of b and we square it. So half of negative 8 is negative 4, and we square it. And we write it on both sides because algebra is about balance. Whatever you do to one side, you do to the other side. All right. Next, we are going to factor this little guy. And the factor on the left would be, by the way, when this is simplified, it's k squared minus 8k plus 16. All right. So the factor over there on the left side would be k minus 4 times k minus 4. I'm going to go ahead and simplify on this right side. 48 plus 16 is 64. I know that k minus 4 can be rewritten as k minus 4 squared. And now we just finish this little bad boy by solving by square root. So to solve by square root, you just take the square root of both sides. Now we've got k minus 4 equals plus or minus 8, because the square root of 64 is 8. You want to finish it off by adding a 4 to both sides, so k equals 4 plus or minus 8. And we can actually continue this problem. One of the answers is 4 plus 8, and the other answer is 4 minus 8. So 4 plus 8 is 12, and 4 minus 8 is negative 4. So there's our two answers. Nice. All right, guys, I'm going to do a few more. I want to do some that require us to factor out a number at the very beginning. All right, so here's my last, one of my last problems I'm going to do. Let's do 2x squared plus 2x minus 17 equals 0. Alrighty, guys. So this one's different because our leading coefficient is 2. On the previous problems, the leading coefficient, which is the number in front of your highest exponent, our leading coefficients were 1 on the previous problem. So look here. This one was 1k squared. This one was 1x squared. All right, so when our leading coefficient is greater than 1, here's what you want to do with that problem. First thing you want to do is, you still started off the same way as before. We move this constant over to the other side. All right, so I am going to add a 17 to both sides. All right, so here comes that different part. Because the leading coefficient is greater than 1, now you want to factor out the leading coefficient. So I'm going to factor out the number 2. Now, once you factor out that number 2, whatever we plug in on the right side of the equation, we need to multiply it by 2. From here, the rest of our problem is going to be just like the previous problems. So you want to complete the perfect square trinomial, half of 1 squared. So 1/2 squared. Okay, now I'm going to factor this stuff over here. And let me tell you guys a little trick before I continue this one. When you're factoring, or when you get to that factoring part of completing the square, a little trick you can do is you can just bring down the constant, or not the constant, but the variable. So our variable is k for that problem. And then bring down the number in the parentheses. So the -4 and -4 ended up right here. And that works like every single time. So if you look up at this other one, bring down the variable, which is x, and then bring down the number in the parentheses, a +8, and that gives us the factors. So I'm going to do the same thing on this problem now. I'm going to bring down the variable, and our variable is x. And then I'm going to bring down the number in the parentheses, a +1/2. So that's factored now. Okay, now I need to simplify over here on this right side. We've got 17 plus 2 times a fourth. 2 times a fourth is 1/2. So now we've got 17 plus 1/2. And 17 plus 1/2 is going to give us 17.5, right? Which would be 35 over 2. All right, this is where it gets a little different. On the previous problems, we just took the square root of both sides at this point, but for this one, we need to divide by 2 first, and then we'll take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to divide by 2. That'll make this a 35 over 4, because when you divide by a fraction, you multiply by the reciprocal. And now I'm just going to continue this bad boy. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. This will be x plus 1/2 equals plus or minus square root 35 over 2, because the square root of 4 is 2. And then we finish it off subtracting 1/2 from both sides. So x equals negative 1/2 plus or minus, sorry, trying to show you guys all that work, plus or minus the square root of 35 over 2. And that's our final answer. All right, guys, I'm going to do one more problem, okay? So let's see. All right, so here's our last problem. So for this last problem, this one's a little bit different because I've got a constant on both sides of the equation. I'm still going to do the same thing though. I'll still move this number over to the right side because we always want our constants on the right side of the equation. So this will be 4x squared plus 4x plus a blank equals 4 plus a blank. All right, and remember, anytime that leading coefficient is greater than 1, first thing you want to do is factor that bad boy out. So I'm going to factor the 4 out of each of those terms. And when we factor out a number, that leading coefficient, we've got to multiply our blank over here by that leading coefficient. And now we just continue our regular scheduled program, right? So we complete the square, or complete the perfect square trinomial. It's technically a 1 right here. Half of 1 is 1/2. And we square it. All right, and then we've got 4 times x plus a half. Remember that trick from earlier? Bring down the variable and bring down the number in the parentheses, positive 1/2. Okay, it equals 4 plus 4 times 1/4. And 4 times 1/4 is just 1. Okay, so that makes that on the right side just 4 plus 1, which is 5. And then we just continue by solving by square root. So you would divide by 4 on both sides. And then you would take the square root of both sides. That makes this x plus a half squared equals plus or minus square root 5 over 2. And I don't need that square there anymore. I got rid of it. All right, and then you want to end this problem just by subtracting 1/2 from both sides. So x is equal to negative 1/2 plus or minus square root 5 over 2. And that's our final answer. All right, guys, if you have any questions, you can leave them in the open discussion section of this video. And have a good day.